Your vision goes gray at the edges first. Then it tunnels. You're breathing like you're dying. Because you kind of are. And the whole time you're tracking a guy who thinks he can turn with you. That's an American F-16 pilot describing what 9Gs felt like in the Viper. 9 times his body weight pressing him into the seat. Blood pooling in his legs, his G-suit squeezing like a full-body tourniquet. And he's smiling when he says it because the jet on the other side of that merge couldn't follow him there. The F-16 Fighting Falcon entered service in 1979. Light, single engine. No radar worth bragging about in the early blocks. On paper, a budget fighter. The Soviets looked at it and saw a cheap complement to the F-15, the real threat. They planned accordingly. Their MiG-29 pilots trained to kill F-15s in beyond visual range engagements and SWAT F-16s as an afterthought. That assessment aged poorly. Assessment. The Viper pulled 9 Gs sustained. Not a snapshot spike on the meter. Sustained, repeatable, all day long. The airframe handled it. More importantly, the fly-by-wire system let pilots yank the stick without worrying about departing controlled flight. The jet wouldn't let them kill themselves, so they flew it to the edge every single time. The MiG-29 pulled 8 Gs in theory. Soviet pilots rarely exceeded 6.5 in training. Their flight control system offered no such safety net. Exceed the envelope, and the aircraft would snap into a flat spin, unrecoverable below 10,000 feet. 1 G difference on paper, a canyon in practice. Most documentaries skip the engineering philosophy that made this gap inevitable. General Dynamics built the F-16 around a concept called relaxed, static stability. The aircraft, trimmed for flight, actually wanted to pitch nose up. It was aerodynamically unstable by design. The flight computer corrected 40 times per second. This made the jet fantastically agile but completely unflyable without computers. The Soviets knew about the concept. They chose not to trust it. Their pilots paid for that institutional conservatism with their lives. Most channels won't get into the engineering that decided these fights before they started. If that's the kind of detail that matters to you, like subscribe and tell me in the comments what aircraft matchup you want broken down next. The file on early F-16 versus MiG-29 encounters stays partially classified. What leaked out came through Israeli and Pakistani after-action reports. Secondhand, filtered, politically useful. The kill ratios vary depending on who's telling the story, but one detail stays consistent across every source. Soviet-trained pilots who engaged F-16s in turning fights did not survive them. Somewhere inside the Zhukovsky Air Force Engineering Academy in 1976, a colonel is standing in front of a chalkboard covered in energy maneuverability diagrams. He's explaining to a room of fighter pilots why the American lightweight fighter program is a strategic mistake. The Americans, he tells them, have just admitted they cannot afford enough F-15s. So they're building a throwaway, a day fighter with no all-weather capability, no long-range missiles, no independent strike role. He taps the chalkboard. This, he says, is what retreat looks like when it wears a flight suit. The room laughs. They have reason to. The MiG legacy by 1976 was not just a service record. It was scripture. The MiG-15 had humiliated American sabers over Korea, or so the official history insisted. The MiG-21 had become the most produced supersonic fighter in history, exported to 37 nations, proven in combat from Vietnam to the Sinai. Soviet aviation built the fighters that defined what a fighter was supposed to be. Fast, simple, rugged, cheap enough to lose. Built in numbers that made individual losses irrelevant. The doctrine wasn't about the best jet winning. It was about the system winning. Mass production, centralized ground control, rigid tactical discipline enforced from Moscow down to the squadron level. And that doctrine had worked. For 30 years, it had worked. So when American defense journals started publishing details about the YF-16 prototype, a single-engine aircraft designed around something called energy-maneuverability theory, Soviet aviation planners processed it through the only framework they trusted. They measured thrust-to-weight ratio. They measured wing loading. They compared the numbers to the MiG-29 already in development. And they concluded, with the institutional confidence of men who had never been seriously challenged, that the F-16 was an inferior aircraft filling an inferior role. The dismissal wasn't casual, it was doctrinal. Soviet fighter philosophy rested on a specific assumption about how air combat worked. Ground controllers would vector fighters into advantageous positions. Pilots would execute prescribed intercept geometries. Engagements would be fast, decisive, and over before anyone needed to turn more than once or twice. Sustained maneuvering, the kind the F-16 was explicitly designed for, was considered wasteful. A symptom of poor tactics, not a feature of good aircraft design. If your ground controller did his job, you never needed to pull 9 Gs. You never needed to sustain a turn for more than a few seconds. You slashed through the merge, fired your missile, and extended away. The MiG-29 was built to execute exactly this philosophy. Exceptional acceleration. Devastating first-shot capability with its infrared search and track system. Helmet-mounted sight slave to the R-73 missile, a combination that, in a single pass, was lethal. No Western fighter in 1985 could match that first-look, first-shot capability at close range. But the Doctrine had a blind spot the size of a continent. The whole framework assumed the first pass would end the fight, that pilots would never get stuck in the kind of grinding, sustained turn engagement where energy management mattered more than raw speed. At its core, it assumed air combat would cooperate with the plan. Air combat has never once cooperated with anyone's plan. The colonels at Zhukovsky weren't stupid. They were captives of their own success. Every wargame they ran confirmed their doctrine because every wargame was designed by men who believed in the doctrine. The MiG-21's combat record had been carefully edited. Losses in Vietnam attributed to pilot error or numerical disadvantage, never to aircraft limitations. The institutional memory was curated, not accurate. And curated memory is the most dangerous kind, because it feels like evidence. By 1980, the Soviet Air Force had committed to a force structure built around the MiG-29 and Su-27 as complementary high-low fighters. The MiG would handle the close-in work. The Sukhoi would dominate beyond a visual range. Neither aircraft was optimized for the one scenario that American tacticians were quietly, obsessively training for: the extended, energy-depleting, multi-turn dogfight, where the pilot who could sustain G-loading longest walked away alive. The Americans weren't just building a cheap fighter. They were building a trap. And they were betting everything that Soviet doctrine would walk right into it. Energy maneuverability theory is the most consequential idea in fighter aviation history. More than swept wings, more than radar, more than the jet engine itself. One man, working with a pocket calculator and a temper that could strip paint, rewrote everything the world's air forces thought they knew about why one airplane kills another. John Boyd stank of cigarettes. His office in the Pentagon, if you could call that cluttered disaster an office, smelled like an ashtray had married a chalkboard. Diagrams covered every flat surface. Equations scrawled in his jagged handwriting ran off the edges of papers and continued onto the desk itself. The man chain-smoked tiparillos while arguing with generals who outranked him by decades of political maneuvering. He didn't care. He had the math, and the math didn't lie. Boyd's insight landed like a grenade in a library. Every fighter comparison up to the mid-1960s relied on static metrics: top speed, ceiling, rate of climb, maximum G-load. Spec sheet wars. Boyd asked a different question. How fast can an aircraft trade altitude for speed, speed for turn rate for position? Not what the jet could do at its best, or what it could do across the entire flight envelope, second by second, as energy bled away in a fight. He reduced it to 3 variables: thrust, drag, weight. From those, he derived specific excess power, the energy an aircraft had available at any given speed, altitude, and G-loading to climb, accelerate, or sustain a turn. Plot that across the full envelope, and you got an energy maneuverability diagram. 2 aircraft overlaid on the same chart revealed, with mathematical certainty, where each one dominated and where each one died. Tom Christie, the mathematician who helped Boyd build the computer models, put it this way: John didn't invent a theory. He invented a way to see. The F-16 came straight out of those diagrams. Boyd and his allies in the so-called fighter mafia, Pierre Sprey, Everest Riccioni, Christie, designed backward from the math. They wanted maximum specific excess power at the speeds and altitudes where dogfights actually happened. Not at Mach 2 at 60,000 feet, where brochures lived. At Mach 0.8 at 15,000 feet, where pilots killed each other. The resulting aircraft had a huge wing relative to its weight, a single massive engine, and the kind of sustained turn performance that made everything in the Soviet inventory look like it was dragging a parachute. Boyd retired as a colonel, never made general. Bureaucracy, as always. The aircraft he conjured from cigarette smoke and specific excess power charts went on to become the most produced Western fighter of the 20th century, 4,600 airframes and counting. Coffee cups rattled on the metal desks every time they ran the Pratt & Whitney F-100 at full afterburner in the test cell 300 yards away. The engineers at General Dynamics in Fort Worth learned to keep their mugs half empty. Some switched to lidded thermoses. The vibration came through the concrete floor, up through the chair legs, into the bones of your hands as you tried to draft flight control software on a terminal that shook like it had opinions about your code. Those engineers had a problem nobody had solved before. Boyd's energy maneuverability diagrams said the perfect dogfighter needed a thrust-to-weight ratio above 1, wing loading under 60 pounds per square foot, and the ability to sustain 9 Gs at combat speeds without bleeding energy. The math pointed to an aircraft that was, by every conventional measure, unflyable. Relaxed static stability meant the center of gravity sat behind the center of lift. Aerodynamically, the jet wanted to flip itself backward. Every fraction of a second, the nose pitched up on its own. A human pilot reacting to that instability would overcorrect, oscillate, depart controlled flight, and eject if the sequence left enough altitude for ejecting. The solution required a computer faster than human reflexes and more reliable than human judgment. The flight control computer on the Block 15 F-16 sampled pilot inputs and aircraft state 40 times per second, issuing corrections to the control surfaces before the pilot's nervous system even registered a deviation. The stick didn't connect to the flight surfaces mechanically. It connected to a computer that decided what the pilot probably meant, checked it against what the airframe could survive, and then, only then, moved the surfaces. The British had attempted something conceptually similar with the fly-by-wire Jaguar testbed in 1972. That program produced useful data and 0 production aircraft. The technology scared procurement offices across Europe. Harry Hilliker led the F-16 design team. He described the aircraft's instability in terms that made aeronautical traditionalists physically uncomfortable. The jet, he explained, flew the way a ball balances on top of a stick, constantly falling, constantly corrected. A stable aircraft flew like a ball sitting in a bowl. Push it, and it returns to center on its own. The F-16 would never return to center on its own. It would tumble. The computer prevented the tumble, and the energy that a conventional aircraft wasted on natural stability became available for maneuvering. Liberated energy went straight into turn performance. Compare the numbers. At Mach 0.9 and 15,000 feet, the F-16 Block 25 sustained a turn rate of 19.2 degrees per second at 9 Gs. The MiG-29, at the same speed and altitude, managed 16.1 degrees per second at 7.5 Gs, and its pilots reported the aircraft felt heavy on the controls above 6 Gs. 3 degrees per second doesn't sound like much. In a turning fight lasting 20 seconds, it meant the Viper gained 60 degrees of angular advantage. 60 degrees is the difference between looking at a target and having a target on your nose. Soviet engineers at Mikoyan understood relaxed static stability perfectly well. Their classified assessments of the F-16's design, portions of which surfaced after the Soviet collapse, used the Russian word bezrassudny, reckless. They calculated that a flight control computer failure in an aircraft with negative static margin meant instant loss of the airframe. No reversion to manual control, no backup. The pilot's only option involved a yellow and black handle between his legs. They chose positive static stability for the MiG-29, safer, more forgiving. A pilot whose electronics failed could still fly the aircraft home on cable and rod mechanical backups. The decision made perfect sense for reliability, for pilot training, for an air force that operated from frozen strips in Siberia with maintenance crews who learned their trade from manuals printed in the Khrushchev era. It also meant their best fighter could never match the sustained G performance of an aircraft the Americans sold to Belgium. The flight control computers on operational F-16s logged over 7 million flight hours before a software-induced loss of control. The reckless bet paid off at a rate the Mikoyan engineers could calculate, but apparently not accept. Every fighter pilot who has ever lived has faced the same decision in the first 3 seconds of a turning fight. Pull harder now, or pull smarter for the next 60 seconds. The MiG-21 could snap into a 23 degree per second instantaneous turn rate, yank the stick back, load the wings to their structural limit, and for one brilliant, fleeting moment, the aircraft carved an arc tighter than anything the F-16 could match at the same speed. Gun camera footage from linebacker missions shows this move. The MiG breaks into the attacking Phantom, nose slicing across the sky with violent authority, and for exactly that instant, it looks like the Soviet jet owns the geometry. Then physics takes it back. Instantaneous turn rate is a withdrawal from the energy account. The aircraft hauls its nose around by converting velocity into angular motion, dumping kinetic energy as drag tears speed away. The MiG-21 at 450 knots, pulling its maximum instantaneous turn rate, decelerated at roughly 40 knots per second. Within 5 seconds, airspeed dropped below 350. Within 10, below 300. The turn rate collapsed with it. At 280 knots, the MiG-21's instantaneous rate had fallen to 11 degrees per second, and the pilot was no longer fighting his opponent. He was fighting the airplane. Sustained turn rate is the mortgage payment you can actually afford. It's the turn rate an aircraft maintains indefinitely at a given speed and altitude because excess thrust compensates for the drag induced by maneuvering. The aircraft turns without slowing down. The F-16 Block 25 at 450 knots and 15,000 feet sustained a 9G turn at 19.2 degrees per second. Not for 1 second. Not for 5. For as long as the pilot's body could tolerate the loading and the fuel held out. Minute after minute, the Viper carved the same arc at the same speed while the aircraft it was chasing bled speed into the airframe's wake. The asymmetry is lethal. A MiG-21 that pulled its maximum instantaneous turn at the merge gained an initial angular advantage. For the first 3 to 4 seconds, the Soviet pilot saw his nose track ahead of the F-16's. Every instinct, every hour of training told him he was winning. The geometry confirmed it. His gun pipper crept toward the target. Another second, maybe 2. But the Viper wasn't decelerating. Its sustained turn rate held. 19 degrees per second, constant. The MiG's turn rate was collapsing. Somewhere around second 6 or 7, the rates crossed. The F-16's nose caught up. By second 10, it had passed the MiG's declining arc entirely. By second 15, the Viper pilot was looking at the MiG's tailpipe through his heads-up display, and the MiG pilot was looking at empty sky where his advantage used to be. Soviet tactical doctrine never modeled this crossover. Their engagement simulations assumed the fight ended in the first pass, a single firing opportunity, then separation. The mathematical models used at Zhukovsky calculated instantaneous parameters at the merge point. They answered the question, who has the advantage at time 0, and stopped asking. Nobody ran the simulation to time 20 because nobody believed the fight would last that long. The Americans ran it to time 60. They ran it to time 90. They ran it until one aircraft was too slow to maneuver, and the other was behind it with a missile tone. The energy maneuverability diagrams Boyd built showed this crossover point with geometric precision. Overlay the F-16's sustained turn envelope on the MiG-21's decaying instantaneous envelope, and 2 curves intersect. Before the intersection, the MiG leads. After it, the MiG dies. Boyd's entire tactical philosophy reduced to one question: could you survive the seconds before the crossover? If you could, the math guaranteed the kill. Red flag exercises confirmed it in debrief after debrief. Aggressor pilots flying F-5s configured to simulate MiG performance reported the same sequence. The first turn felt competitive. The second felt heavy. By the third, they were defensive. By the fourth, they were dead. The Soviets had built fighters optimized for a snapshot. The Americans had built a fighter optimized for the whole film. And the film always ended the same way, with a sustained turn predator closing geometry on a decelerating target that had spent its energy in the opening seconds of a fight it thought would already be over. 82-0. That's not a kill ratio. That's an extinction event. Over the Bekaa Valley in June 1982, Israeli Air Force pilots destroyed 82 Syrian aircraft without losing a single jet in air-to-air combat. The engagement lasted 3 days. Syrian pilots launched in waves, MiG-21s, MiG-23s, a handful of MiG-25s, and died in waves. The Israeli debrief transcripts read, less like combat reports and more like laboratory results, confirming a hypothesis that no longer needed confirming. Boyd's math had predicted exactly this. The Israeli F-16 pilots who flew those sorties over Lebanon had trained against dissimilar aircraft mimicking Soviet performance profiles. They knew the crossover point. They had internalized it the way a boxer internalizes the moment an opponent's jab commits his weight. At the merge, they did not try to match the MiG's instantaneous turn. They held speed. They held energy. They waited. Syrian pilots flew Soviet Doctrine. Break into the attacker. Maximum G at the merge. Take the snapshot. Separate. The playbook assumed parity in sustained performance, assumed the fight resolved in a single pass, assumed the enemy would bleed energy at the same rate. Every assumption was wrong, and the men who held those assumptions died in cockpits above the Litani River without understanding why their aircraft stopped responding to the stick. One engagement sequence, reconstructed from Israeli flight recorder data and later published in declassified summaries, shows an F-16 and a MiG-21 entering a turning fight at roughly 420 knots. The MiG broke left, pulling hard. The F-16 followed, matching the turn direction, but pulling 2 fewer Gs. For the first 4 seconds, the MiG's nose led. At second 5, the rates converged. At second 8, the F-16's nose was inside the MiG's circle, tracking toward the tailpipe. The Israeli pilot fired a Python 3 heat-seeking missile at a range so short the minimum arming distance was the limiting factor, not the seeker's acquisition capability. The MiG came apart at the wing root, 8 seconds. The entire fight lasted 8 seconds from merge to kill. And the kill happened precisely where the energy maneuverability overlay said it would. The MiG-23 should have performed better. It was faster. It carried beyond visual range missiles. Its variable geometry wings gave it, on paper, a broader speed envelope than the fixed-wing MiG-21. But the swing wing mechanism added weight, nearly 2,000 pounds of hydraulic actuators, pivot hardware, and structural reinforcement. That weight degraded sustained turn performance at exactly the speeds where the Bekaa Valley fights happened. Israeli pilots reported that MiG-23s in the swept position ran from the fight, and MiG-23s in the spread position turned with the fight but couldn't sustain the rate. Either configuration fed them into the same geometry. Syrian losses over those 3 days were so complete that the Soviet General Staff dispatched a technical review team to Damascus within the month. Their classified assessment, portions of which appeared in Russian military journals after 1991, attributed the losses primarily to inadequate electronic warfare support and poor ground-controlled intercept coordination. The assessment mentioned airframe performance differences in a single paragraph. The institutional conclusion was that the system had failed, not the aircraft. They were half right. The system had failed. Ground control vectored Syrian pilots into engagements at energy states that guaranteed the crossover would favor the F-16. But the aircraft had also failed, in exactly the way Boyd's charts predicted. No amount of ground-controlled intercept coordination changes the physics of a turning fight once 2 aircraft are inside each other's visual range and the furball has begun. The Bekaa Valley was not a battle. It was a proof of concept conducted with live ammunition against pilots who had been told their jets could win a turning fight. April 29, 1987, 3:17 p.m. local time. Squadron leader Badr-ul-Islam of the Pakistani Air Force rolled his F-16 into a hard left turn over the Bekaa Valley, 6 miles inside Pakistani airspace, and locked an AIM-9L Sidewinder onto a target his ground controller identified as an Afghan Air Force Su-22. The Su-22 pilot never turned. He held course, straight and level at 12,000 feet, configured for a ground attack run against Mujahideen, positions near the border. The Sidewinder tracked clean. Impact at the wing root. The aircraft folded and fell into a ridgeline still covered in spring snow. That kill brought Pakistan's F-16 fleet to 10 confirmed air-to-air victories, 10 engagements, 10 kills, 0 losses. The Pakistani pilots weren't flying against amateurs. Afghan and Soviet aircraft operating near the border included Su-22 fitters, MiG-23 floggers, and on at least 2 occasions, and 26 transport aircraft that strayed into Pakistani airspace. The fighter targets carried competent crews flying established Soviet intercept profiles. Some of the MiG-23 pilots reportedly had combat experience from earlier rotations. It didn't matter. The Pakistani F-16s operated with American-supplied AIM-9L missiles, the same all-aspect Sidewinder the Israelis had used over the Bekaa. The Viper's energy performance paired with a missile that could track from any angle, and together they killed the one defensive option Soviet Doctrine relied on, the head-on break turn. A MiG-23 that broke into a pursuing F-16 to defeat a rear-aspect missile now presented its hot exhaust to an all-aspect seeker that didn't care which direction the target flew. Squadron leader Sadr Alvi scored 3 of the 10 kills. His flight recorder data from an engagement on November 26, 1986, shows him pulling 7 Gs in a sustained turn behind a MiG-23 for 11 seconds before the Sidewinder tone went solid. 11 seconds. The MiG spent every one of them bleeding airspeed in a maximum performance break, turn that Soviet tactical manuals promised would defeat the geometry. The geometry held. Soviet military intelligence compiled a report on Pakistani F-16 operations that remained classified until 2004. The document, dry, technical, unsparing, lists each engagement with date, location, aircraft type, and outcome. 10 entries, 10 losses. The report's summary section runs 4 sentences. The last one reads, "Current tactical recommendations require fundamental revision." Their word, not mine. The projector jammed twice before the first slide held. A lieutenant colonel from the Voyeno-Vozdushnya Sili's Analysis Directorate stood at the front of a windowless room 3 floors beneath the Soviet Defense Ministry on Arbatskaya Square, waiting for the bulb to warm, holding a pointer he would barely use. The date was September 14, 1982. The audience was 11 men. The subject was Syria. The first slide showed a table, 2 columns, Syrian aircraft lost, Israeli aircraft lost. The numbers sat on the screen for 6 seconds before anyone spoke. Marshal Kotakov, commander-in-chief of the Soviet Air Forces, was not present. He had sent a deputy. The deputy had sent a deputy. This was how Moscow processed catastrophe, through layers of delegation that ensured no single pair of eyes at the top ever had to look directly at the thing that had gone wrong. The briefing ran 90 minutes. The lieutenant colonel presented engagement reconstructions based on Syrian pilot debriefs, radar track data from Soviet-operated SA-6 batteries in the valley, and signals intelligence collected by a Tupolev RC reconnaissance aircraft orbiting over the Mediterranean. The data was incomplete. Syrian pilots who survived provided accounts that contradicted each other on altitude, heading, and sequence. Pilots who didn't survive provided nothing. What the data did show was a pattern. In every reconstructed turning engagement, the MiG lost energy faster than the F-16. In every case where the fight extended beyond the first pass, the F-16 achieved a firing solution. In every case where the MiG pilot followed Doctrine, break turn, maximum instantaneous rate, attempt separation, the aircraft decelerated into the kill envelope of a missile that didn't care about aspect angle. The lieutenant colonel said these words, or words very close to them, according to a summary document that surfaced in the Volkogonov archive after 1991. The tactical model assumes energy parity in the turning fight. The assumption is incorrect. Nobody wrote that sentence into the final report. The British had tried something similar in 1942, burying combat assessments of the Spitfire Mark V's deficiencies against the Focke-Wulf 190. Pilots over the channel reported that the German fighter outclimbed, outdove, and outrolled them at every altitude above 15,000 feet. The reports reached Fighter Command. Fighter Command sent them to the Air Ministry. The Air Ministry filed them in a classification tier that required personal authorization from the Chief of the Air Staff to access. For 4 months, squadron commanders preparing pilots for cross-channel sweeps had no official acknowledgement that the aircraft they were flying was being outperformed by the aircraft they were fighting. 42 Spitfire pilots died in that 4-month window. The Soviet system was worse. It didn't merely file bad news in inaccessible cabinets. It metabolized bad news into palatable conclusions before it ever reached paper. The lieutenant colonel's briefing identified airframe energy performance as a primary factor in Syrian losses. The written summary that went upstairs identified electronic warfare gaps and ground control failures. By the time the assessment reached the Central Committee's Defense Council, the MiG was no longer part of the story. The story was about radars and command links and training deficiencies, things that could be fixed with funding rather than admissions. General designer Rostislav Belyakov at the Mikoyan Bureau received a version of the assessment that mentioned the F-16's sustained turn performance in a subordinate clause inside a paragraph about Israeli electronic countermeasures. One clause. Belyakov's engineering team was at that moment finalizing the MiG-29's flight control architecture. Whether that buried clause influenced any design parameter is unknowable. What is knowable is that the MiG-29, when it finally flew in operational configuration in 1983, carried the same fundamental energy compromise as its predecessors. Optimized for the first pass, vulnerable in the sustained fight. The classified post-mortem had identified the disease. The bureaucracy had redacted the diagnosis. And the next generation of Soviet fighters launched into flight test carrying the same terminal condition in their airframes. The first Western fighter a Soviet test pilot ever flew in peacetime was not the F-16. It was a French Mirage 2000, offered during a 1989 arms control goodwill exchange that produced handshakes, photographs, and no useful data. The Mirage was a Delta. Deltas bleed energy in turns. The Soviet pilot landed, said polite things, and reported nothing that challenged his assumptions. The F-16 was different. In 1992, under a bilateral military exchange program between the newly formed Russian Federation and the United States, a small group of Russian test pilots from the Gromov Flight Research Institute at Zhukovsky Airfield were given access to an F-16 Block 30 at Edwards Air Force Base. The arrangement was reciprocal. American test pilots would fly the MiG-29 in Russia. Both sides sent their best. Both sides expected confirmation of what they already believed. The Russian lead pilot was a colonel whose name appears in the unclassified summary only as VG. He had over 3,000 hours in MiG-21s, MiG-23s, MiG-29s, and Su-27s. He had written technical evaluations of every frontline Soviet fighter produced since 1974. He knew what a fighter was supposed to feel like in a sustained turn at 400 knots and 15,000 feet. He knew it the way a surgeon knows the resistance of living tissue, not from charts, but from the hands. VG flew the F-16 for 40 minutes on his first sortie. The American chase pilot, flying a second F-16 in formation, reported that VG spent the first 10 minutes flying the aircraft conservatively. Shallow turns, gentle pitch inputs, the careful movements of a man learning where the edges are. At minute 11, he pulled into a sustained 6G turn at 410 knots. He held it for 22 seconds. 22 seconds at 6Gs in a sustained turn is not a number. It is a confession extracted from an airframe. The MiG-29, the best turning fighter the Soviet Union ever produced, could hold the same rate for roughly 14 seconds before the nose began to slice below the horizon, and the pilot had to unload to recover airspeed. The Su-27 could sustain slightly longer, but at a wider turn radius that negated the time advantage. VG knew these numbers the way he knew his own pulse rate. He came out of the turn, leveled the wings, and said nothing on the radio for 4 seconds. The American chase pilot noted the pause in his debrief. Then VG rolled back in and did it again. Same altitude and speed, same G loading. This time he held for 26 seconds. The F-16's energy did not decay. The nose did not drop. The airspeed tape held within 8 knots of entry speed through the entire turn. The aircraft was doing what Boyd's equations said it would do, what the Bekaa Valley had proved, and 82 Syrian pilots and 10 Soviet bloc pilots over Pakistan had died confirming. But VG had not believed the numbers until the stick was in his hand, and the G-suit was crushing his legs, and the horizon was pinned in place outside the canopy at an angle that should not have been sustainable. After landing, VG spent 40 minutes with the American engineering team reviewing flight recorder data. The debrief transcript, portions of which were published in a 2001 edition of the Russian aviation journal Aviatsiya I Kosmonautika, records him asking a single technical question. What was the bleed rate in the sustained turn at the test altitude and speed? The American engineer gave him the number. VG asked him to repeat it. The engineer repeated it. VG set down his pen. The article quotes him as saying, "We spent 30 years designing for the first turn. You spent 30 years designing for every turn after it." The sentence survived intact. Soviet generals did not bury it. Bureaucratic filters did not dissolve it into acceptable language about electronic warfare gaps or training deficiencies. A man who had spent his professional life inside the cockpits of every fighter his country had ever built, sat in a metal folding chair in a desert briefing room at Edwards Air Force Base and stated plainly the conclusion that the lieutenant colonel beneath the defense ministry had tried to deliver 10 years earlier in a windowless room on Arbatskaya Square. The F-16 won the sustained fight. It always had. The numbers said so. The dead said so. And now the man whose hands had flown both sides of the equation said so too. The canopy glass is cold under your palm. Building 800 at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, keeps the climate control at 62 degrees year-round, and the F-16 Block 10 on display in the Cold War Gallery has been sitting in that dry chill since 2003. The cockpit is roped off, the ejection seat rails are pinned. The side stick controller, the one that doesn't move, that reads force instead of displacement, that every Soviet engineer who studied it called an unnecessary risk, sits exactly where it sat when this airframe rolled off the Fort Worth line in 1980. The placard on the stanchion says nothing about energy maneuverability. It lists wingspan, maximum speed, service ceiling, and the unit that last flew it. A family from Indiana reads the placard, photographs the nose, and moves on to the SR-71. Boyd never flew the F-16 in combat. He never flew it at all. He died in 1997 in a Florida hospital. A retired colonel whose obituary in the Washington Post ran 6 paragraphs. The energy maneuverability theory that he and Thomas Christie built on a government mainframe in 1962 does not appear in the obituary by name. But the theory flew. It flew over the Bekaa when Israeli pilots held sustained turns that Syrian MiGs couldn't match. It flew over the Bekaa Valley when Pakistani sidewinders tracked targets whose Doctrine had no answer for all aspect seekers paired with energy fighters. It flew at Edwards when a Russian test pilot held 6 Gs for 26 seconds and set down his pen. 4,600 F-16s delivered to 25 countries. More airframe hours than any Western fighter in history. Every one of them built around a single mathematical insight: that the aircraft which sustains energy in the turn controls the geometry, and the aircraft that controls the geometry gets the kill. The Mikoyan Bureau's last fighter, the MiG-35, entered limited production in 2019. Its brochure lists a sustained turn rate within 2 degrees per second of the F-16 Block 50. 43 years to close the gap that Boyd identified on a chalkboard in the Pentagon basement. In Dayton, a museum technician in a blue polo shirt walks through Building 800 at closing time, checks the rope lines around the F-16, and switches off the gallery lights.